One of the perks of the modern age is the rate at which we are solving decades-old cold cases. From identifying Jane and John Does, who spent over 30 years without names, to discovering the truth behind creepy serial killer cases which terrorized a nation for decades. The true crime world is seeing old cases solved on a regular basis, but of course, there are cases that fall through the cracks. Join us for today's episode as we examine 3 horrific cases of unidentified killers who were never caught. The Rainbow Maniac. The Rainbow Maniac is a name given to the individual who carried out the Pituras Park murders in Carapicuíba, São Paulo, Brazil, between February 2007 and August 2009. The Guardian noted that about 6 months after Pride was celebrated in São Paulo in 2008, authorities revealed that they were hunting a serial killer thought to be responsible for as many as 16 murders in the city. Generally, the Rainbow Maniac is described as being responsible for at least 13 killings, with all victims being gay men between the ages of 20 and 40. 11 of the 13 victims were shot in the head. 1 victim died from being beaten around the head, and another was shot 12 times. When discussing the latter case, police told the media that the bullets had reduced the body to a sieve. Most of the victims were attacked in Pituras Park, described as a meeting place for gay men, and as an area that is frequented by sex workers at night. 1 victim was killed in a motel room. In 2008, law enforcement was investigating whether or not 3 further deaths which had occurred in the neighboring city of Osaka was connected to the Pituras Park slayings. The local police chief at the time stated that the attacks were clearly motivated by hate. Quote, "In his head, he thinks he is doing a cleanup job. He doesn't like the homosexuals, he hates them." The first victim in this string of horrific crimes was 32-year-old Jose Henrique, killed in Pituras Park on July 4th, 2007. Almost all of the deceased were found half naked, tossed into the undergrowth at the park like trash, their trousers at their knees, a .38 caliber bullet in the back of their skulls. Despite the fact that most of the victims' deaths had occurred identically, it took until mid to late 2008 for investigators to realize there may be a connection between the cases, with the police noting, "The case has now gone beyond the limits of such a common crime," referring to how the cases had been treated as individual acts of violence, something commonplace in the city at the time. The police added, "We are dealing with a suspect who kills homosexuals exclusively." A team of 15 detectives was put together shortly afterwards, and to help prevent further attacks, plain-clothed police officers were sent to patrol the park at night. Additionally, ballistic testing began so that investigators could determine whether or not it was the same weapon being used across all the murders. For a brief time, a man who frequented the park was considered a suspect after he found the bodies of 3 of the 12 victims. However, gunshot residue testing was carried out on the man, and the results were negative. He subsequently began acting as a liaison with the police, and he told the media, "People know the risk, but they don't care. Pituras is our meeting place, and no one is going to stop getting it on there because of this wacko." On December 10th, 2008, a retired state police sergeant named Jairo Francisco Franco was arrested in relation to the case. Several months earlier, a witness identified him as the perpetrator of one of the murders, though Franco himself denied any and all involvement. At the time of his arrest, he was working as a private security guard in a supermarket. The police told news outlets, "We have a credible witness who says he saw Franco pump 12 bullets into a black gay man inside the park." One further witness claimed that Franco was a regular at the park, and he, quote, apparently cruised for gay men and victims. The police later added, "We are convinced he is the Rainbow Maniac we have been looking for." However, though the case went to trial in 2011, the 48-year-old former sergeant was acquitted of the murders. The Paturas Park murders are still unsolved. The Atlanta Ripper. Between 1909 and 1914, the infamous Atlanta Ripper terrorized the streets of Atlanta, Georgia. Said to be responsible for the deaths of at least 15 women, the Ripper has become almost a mythical figure in the time that has passed. The Ripper is known to have targeted primarily black or mixed-race working-class women, and, like Jack the Ripper, had a tendency to mutilate his victims. The Ripper first struck in October of 1910, when he attacked 23-year-old Maggie Brooke, who was bludgeoned across the head and suffered a fractured skull. Then, on January 22nd, 35-year-old Rosa Trice's remains were discovered not far from her home. Her death was reportedly more brutal than Maggie's. Her skull had been crushed, her throat had been slashed, and she'd even been stabbed in the jaw. The Atlanta Constitution wrote that her husband was arrested for the killing, but was released shortly afterwards due to a lack of evidence. The following month, the remains of another woman were found in the woods by the West Point Belt car line. The woman is described as being black and around the age of 25, but she has never been identified. Then on May 28, 1911, the body of Belle Walker was located 25 yards from her home on Garibaldi Street. Her sister had reported her missing not long before she was found, after discovering that she had failed to return home from work. Belle's throat had been viciously slashed, and the following month, the body of Addie Watts turned up, having suffered the exact same injury. Fear gripped the black and mixed-race communities of Atlanta. The vast majority of the killings had taken place in the city's 4th Ward, where street lighting was poor and there were no trams, meaning many workers had to trudge home alone on foot in the pitch black, leaving them exposed to the killer. In his book, The Atlanta Ripper, The Unsolved Case of the Gate City's Most Infamous Murders, Jeffrey Wells wrote that many of the victims were domestic servants who worked in the homes of white employers in the old 4th Ward and the outlying areas. He added that one attack happened just down the street from the victim's employer's home, and added that the employer heard the commotion. When he emerged, he found the victim, but was not able to identify the killer. In July of 1911, 40-year-old Lena Sharp became the Ripper's next victim and produced the first possible eyewitness testimony in the killings. One newspaper from the time reported that Lena's daughter went looking for her when she was late home, aware that their neighbor had recently been killed by the Ripper. While looking for her mother, she bumped into a tall black man who told her, quote, "Don't worry, I never hurt girls like you." He then stabbed her in the back and fled the scene. However, another paper claimed that Emma Lou, Lena's daughter, had been walking with her mother when Lena was struck with a brick and Emma Lou was stabbed. The assailant then slit Lena's throat before returning to Emma Lou and standing over her with a knife. He ran from the scene when he heard footsteps approaching. Sadie Holly was found dead on July 11, 1911, just 10 days after Lena's murder. Her injuries were so bad that she'd almost been decapitated. A suspect in Sadie's case was identified as a cab driver who'd argued with her on the night of her death, and who was found with scratches on his arm and blood on his clothing. He was indicted, but found not guilty, because the killings continued even while he was in jail. In the second half of 1911, the bodies of Mary Ann Duncan, Eva Florence, Minnie Wise, and Mary Putnam were all located at various times. Jeffrey Wells believes that there are at least 20 victims of the serial killer, and some reports about the case note that even after 1914, the murders and mutilations of black women continued. Whether it was at the hands of the Atlanta Ripper or a new assailant is unclear. Many people have also theorized that multiple individuals were responsible for the murders, rather than a lone man. It has also been speculated that some murders attributed to the Ripper were actually done at the hands of men who wanted to get rid of their wives, that they took advantage of the hysteria and disguised domestic violence as the work of a serial killer. The Atlanta Ripper has never been identified. New Bedford Highway Killer. The New Bedford Highway Killer is the name given to a serial killer responsible for 9 deaths and 2 disappearances over the span of about a year between March 1988 and April 1989. The victims were all women, were either sex workers or people struggling with substance abuse, sometimes both, and were mostly taken from New Bedford, Massachusetts, and dumped in various surrounding towns along Route 140 after they were killed. The first known victim of the New Bedford Highway Killer was 29-year-old Robin Lynn Rhodes, sometimes referred to as Bobby Lynn. Robin's remains were found on March 29, 1989, but she was known to have disappeared approximately 1 year earlier, in March or April of 1988, leaving behind a young child. Like many of the victims, she had been struggling with drug addiction for some time, and although she was not a sex worker herself, Robin was familiar with several other victims and was even friends with one, Mary Rose Santos. She also dated one of the case's main suspects, Kenneth Ponte. Mary Rose Santos was last seen by her family on July 16, 1988, after her husband dropped her off near the downtown bus station in New Bedford. She was later seen dancing at the old Quarterdeck Lounge about 5 hours later. She never came home that night, and her body was recovered on March 31, 1989, along Route 88 in Westport. She had been left nude. Mary was both a sex worker and a drug addict who had recently made up with her husband after he had discovered what she had been doing to earn money. Kenneth Ponte, the same man who had dated Robin, had represented Mary in a civil case and, chillingly, helped her husband make flyers following her disappearance. After Robin's disappearance, a 28-year-old from the town of Falmouth, Massachusetts, named Rochelle Clifford Dopiorala, vanished in April 1988. She was last seen in the company of an ex-convict, the boyfriend of another victim, but he was cleared of responsibility in both cases. Rochelle's remains were found 8 months later on December 10th along Reed Road, 2 miles from Interstate 195. Again, Rochelle had a connection to Kenneth Ponte. She had briefly dated him and stayed at his house. She had also testified against another man during a rape case, which led police to suspect that this man was involved in her murder, but he was ultimately ruled out. Interestingly, Ponte had represented Rochelle during this case. In May 1988, 1 month after Rochelle disappeared, 3 women went missing. The first was Deborah Lynn McConnell, a 25-year-old who was last seen attending her mother's funeral. Deborah was the mother of a young child, and in December, 7 months after she vanished, her body was found off Route 140. She had been dumped in the undergrowth, nude, with a bra wrapped around her neck. The second woman to go missing in May 1988 was Deborah Medeiros, a 29-year-old who was reported missing on the 27th. Deborah had issues with drug abuse and was known to police for this reason. Though she lived with her mother in the city of Fall River, she went missing from New Bedford following a fight with her boyfriend. Her body was found in July 1988 on the side of the road on Interstate 40 in Freetown, making her the first victim whose remains were discovered. Her body had gone through severe decomposition, and, like Deborah McConnell, she was found with a bra wrapped around her neck. She was partially unclothed. Her cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Deborah's boyfriend was ruled out as a suspect in the case. The final woman to go missing in May 1988 was Christina Monteiro, who was just 19 when she disappeared. Like many of the other women, she struggled with drug addiction and left behind a small child when she failed to come home. Unlike the other women, though, Christina's body has never been found. She is still missing to this day. Her family reported that they'd last heard from her in May or June 1988, although there are reports that she was last seen in July. She vanished from New Bedford and is strongly suspected to be a victim of the New Bedford Highway Killer. Similarly, the next victim, Marilyn Roberts, has never been found either. Marilyn was 34 when she vanished from New Bedford. She was last heard from in April 1988, but was purportedly seen 2 months later in June. 36-year-old Nancy Lee Piver vanished after she left the Whispers pub on July 7th, following a fight with her boyfriend, which led her to walk home. She was known to have substance abuse issues, and her boyfriend at the time was a drug dealer who was familiar to the police. Their relationship was reportedly rocky, with rumors and accusations that Nancy was the victim of domestic violence. Still, when the 36-year-old's body turned up on July 30th, her boyfriend was soon ruled out as a suspect. Her nude body was recovered near Interstate 195 westbound in Dartmouth, and her cause of death was found to be strangulation. Mother of 3, Deborah Greenlaw DeMello, a 35-year-old who'd had issues with drug abuse, was last seen on July 11th after walking away from a prison work release program, which she'd been sentenced to due to a charge relating to sex work. Her remains were found off the eastbound Reed Road ramp off Interstate 195 on November 8th. Her clothing was draped across nearby tree branches, and close to the body, investigators located the belongings of the previous victim, Nancy. A 24-year-old mother of 2 named Sandra Botello was the penultimate victim of the New Bedford highway killer. She had intense drug abuse issues and a history of engaging in sex work. She was last seen on August 11th after leaving her home. Her body was the final one located in April 1989 in a wooded area along Interstate 195. Her clothes were missing, and she had been folded into a fetal position. The final victim was 25-year-old Dawn Mendez, who vanished on September 4th, 1988, while walking home alone from her work to a christening party. Like Sandra, Dawn had a history of drug abuse and sex work. Her mostly skeletal remains were found on November 29th on the westbound Reed Road ramp off Interstate 195. Over the years, there have been several suspects in the case of the New Bedford highway killer. The 2 most notable ones are Kenneth Ponte and Anthony DeGrazia. DeGrazia was a 26-year-old construction worker in 1989 who reportedly had a reputation for violence. His image was shown to a sex worker in the New Bedford area who believed he looked like a man who'd tried to choke her. Both her assailant and DeGrazia had a flattened nose, and she recalled that he'd called himself Tony. Still, she was not able to make a positive ID. The sex worker was brought in front of a secret grand jury to testify about her assault a short time later. She explained that Anthony DeGrazia looked similar to her attacker, and that a man named Tony lunged at her throat and tried snapping her neck. He then, quote, told me what he was going to do to me like he did to the other bitches. On the back of her testimony, authorities located DeGrazia and brought him in for questioning. Like Margaret, he was put before the secret grand jury, but he was never indicted. The DA at the time later asked for a warrant for his arrest, accusing DeGrazia of 17 attempted rapes and assaults on several local sex workers. DeGrazia turned himself in, where he was arrested for those charges. He spent 13 months in jail and made 18 court appearances. His lawyers repeatedly asked for documents of evidence, but were denied every time. Similarly, his lawyers asked for his bail to be lowered, as it was considered to be much too high. However, the judge declined. Finally, DeGrazia hired a new lawyer who filed a contempt on the DA's office for non-production of evidence, and the judge subsequently lowered DeGrazia's bail amount, allowing him to be released on June 27, 1990. He was shortly thereafter rearrested for allegedly making threats against the life of the DA who'd had him arrested, Ronald Pena, but DeGrazia made bail and was released once more. 1 month later, on July 17th, he was found dead at the house of his ex-girlfriend's parents. His death was initially considered a homicide by the police who attended the scene, but the DA's office later ruled the case suicide, even though the post-mortem did not support this ruling. Notably, DeGrazia's demise followed an announcement he was the new suspect in the New Bedford highway slayings after Kenneth Ponte, the previous #1 suspect, was released. Despite the media circus surrounding DeGrazia, There is nothing to tie him to the New Bedford Highway murders at this time. Meanwhile, attorney Kenneth Ponte had several links to the case. He dated the first victim, Robin Rhodes, as well as Rochelle, and represented 3 other victims in civil cases. Furthermore, he had a history of drug use. He had been a heroin addict before managing to turn his life around. In the book Shallow Graves, The Hunt for the New Bedford Highway Serial Killer, Maureen Boyle wrote, quote, "The girls on the streets told stories about Ponte's paranoia, how he would bring them to his house, bolt the doors, and wouldn't let them leave. He didn't seem violent, just really strange." In August 1990, a grand jury indicted the 40-year-old in the murder of Rochelle, who was found to have been beaten to death. The DA, Ronald Pena, the same one who'd requested a warrant for Anthony DeGrazia's arrest, proposed the theory that Ponte had killed Rochelle because she was supposedly planning to expose his drug activities. Ponte was arraigned on 1 count of murder on August 17th, to which he pled not guilty. Around 1 year later, in July 1991, the DA dropped the murder charges against him, noting a lack of evidence. In 1992, the remaining charges against him, which consisted of drug use and an assault against Rochelle, were dropped also. The case against Ponte lay dormant for years until 2007, when investigators re-examined the murders and began looking into him once more. They dug up the driveway and patio of his former home in New Bedford, but found no evidence tying him to the case. Marilyn Roberts' father said, quote, "It's hope, anyway," upon seeing the investigation active again. Unfortunately, the hope was short-lived, since no new evidence emerged following this inquiry. Ponte claimed that having his name linked to the murders ruined his life and his career, stating, "When I walk up or down any street, little kids call me a murderer." In an argument with his mother and sister in 2007, he reportedly threatened to kill them both, then himself. 3 years later, he was found dead at the age of 60. Foul play has been ruled out. The case remains unsolved. If you have any information about the New Bedford Highway killings or the perpetrator, you can contact the Bristol County District Attorney's Office at 508-993-2016. Or, if you have information about missing women Christina Monteiro or Marilyn Roberts, you can call the New Bedford Police Department on 508-991-6320. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.